Good afternoon and welcome to our Speaker Series event. My name is Vakhtang Putkaradze. I'm Vice President, Transformation, Science and Technology for ATCO, and I will be your moderator today. I would like to start by introducing ATCO's Chair and CEO, Nancy Southern, who has some welcoming remarks and will introduce our two speakers. In addition to her well-known business leadership with ATCO and our subsidiary companies, as well as Spruce Meadows and Akita Drilling, among others, Nancy has long played a leading role in advocating on social issues of global importance, most notably the rights of Indigenous people and the role of women in business. The topic of this lecture is therefore of particular importance to Nancy's interest as well as ATCO's goals. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Vakhtang. And thank you for the very kind introduction. I am so pleased to join everyone today at our inaugural Speaker Series event. And this one, as Vakhtang said, is very near and dear to my heart. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land who may be located. I would also like to pay my respect to elders, past and present, in the communities and regions where we operate. So to everyone, a very warm welcome, and to all of you joining us today. I know we have a number of my ATCO colleagues, as well as others from academia and the community and business sectors joining us as well. And I truly commend our transformation team led by George Constantinescu, for convening this session and for his team in putting together the speaker series, many of which will follow this inaugural one. These sessions are a chance for us to share knowledge and insights from thought leaders, providing ATCO's people and our network of peers, partners, and friends with information on promising developments, trends, and leadership in relevant fields. Our team says this new series will be covering both technical and somewhat broader topics, like you'll hear about today, encompassing the entire social spectrum. And I think it's very exciting that in January, we will also be talking about biospheres. Again, something that I found very interesting in my novice reading about biospheres. But today, I'm thrilled that our first session will focus on a discussion about better inclusion of Indigenous peoples in environmental research and resource management. We have much work to do in terms of reconciliation and inclusivity. More than 3 decades ago, however, ATCO formed our first partnership between Northland Utilities and the Dene Nations in the Northwest Territories. And I'm very proud to say that more than 3 decades later, we are still partners today. I'm also proud to say that ATCO has established good commerce and great friendships with Indigenous peoples across this great country, from coast to coast to coast. I must note that as a result of decades-long focus on working with Indigenous partners, today we have over 50 formal partnerships and agreements in Canada that generate community benefit and economic participation. And I think these are very different and quite unique in the world of commercial business today, because they aren't just benefits agreements and handouts. They're true participation with equity and job opportunities. When it comes to economic participation in resource development, I'm proud to share with you an exciting celebration that is happening today in Fort Chipewyan, a remote community in the northern reaches of this province. Alongside our partners from Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, the Mikisew Cree First Nation, and Fort Chip Métis Association, we're celebrating the completion of Canada's largest off-grid solar project. And the project includes a 600 kilowatt solar array owned and operated by ATCO and a 2,200 kilowatt solar array owned by all 3 Indigenous communities. It will provide about a quarter of the community's electricity needs and reduces the need to truck in and burn diesel for power generation, by some 800,000 liters annually. And that's just the start of where we're going with our resources and ability to improve the environment in our precious Arctic and subarctic climates. So that gives you a little insight into why ATCO is very interested in hearing more about the research and opportunities that Drs. Peacock and Kutz will share with us. These are two incredible women, full of curiosity, adventure, and courage, breaking out of the mold and absolutely improving our future with their knowledge and their studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome them both. Dr. Kutz is a professor in the Department of Ecosystem and Public Health at the University of Calgary Faculty of Veterinary Medicine and a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Since her first foray into the Yukon in 1988, I think she was maybe 2 years old then, she has worked in the Arctic and subarctic continuously, addressing issues at the animal, environment, and human interface. In partnership with local communities, Dr. Kutz has developed community-based wildlife health surveillance programs with the goal of early detection of changes to wildlife protection of public health and facilitating the incorporation of local and traditional knowledge into wildlife co-management. She is recognized around the Arctic for her wildlife health expertise and recently co-edited the first edition of the book Reindeer and Caribou Health and Disease. She also pioneered the Northern Community Health Veterinary Program in the Sawtooth Settlement area, Northwest Territories, where she and her team have delivered annual veterinary services to 5 Dene communities for 13 consecutive years, and while at the same time providing young veterinarians with unique cross-cultural experiential learnings and opportunities. Now, Dr. Stephanie Peacock has a background in natural sciences, obtaining her PhD in ecology from the University of Alberta in 2015. Her career has centered around evidence-based solutions to problems in conservation biology, tackling issues such as the impact of salmon aquaculture on wild salmon, wildfire management in northern Australia, and climate change effects on the health of Arctic wildlife. She was recently awarded a Banting postdoctoral fellowship supervised by Dr. Kutz to study the threats facing northern caribou herds using a multi-evidence-based approach, incorporating local and Indigenous knowledge. So important. I know we have an example when we built our Alberta power line in northern Alberta. Working with the elders and incorporating the Indigenous knowledge of the caribou's migratory tracks, we actually were able to change the route of the line and the design of the route in order to protect the caribou from their wolf attackers. Today, she will be talking about the ethical and practical benefits of including Indigenous knowledge in wildlife research. Dr. Peacock illustrates by example from the Kutz Research Group's programs in the Arctic. And welcome, Susan and Stephanie, if I may. Thank you to both of you and for leading us off in this first speaker series. I know it's going to be very interesting and exciting for everyone, and we so much appreciate the time that you've given us. And I'll turn it back over to Vaktang to explain the format of today's session. Vaktang?
Thank you, Nancy, for this wonderful introduction. Again, welcome all of you who have joined us. This lecture will be the first in ATCO Speaker Series, as Nancy has mentioned. The next one will be on January 27th on the same time as today. Joining us will be Professor Peter Trock, Science Director of Biosphere 2 in Tucson. Before we get underway with today's lecture, I would like to remind you that this session is one-way video and audio format. You can see and hear the presenters, but they can't hear you. It is not the greatest for audience feedback, so that's why we're encouraging you to ask questions. You can do so by using the question icon at the right of your screen. we will open the question functionality roughly midway through Dr. Peacock's lecture. You can address your questions to either Dr. Kutz or Dr. Peacock or both. With that, I would like to pass the microphone to Dr. Peacock. Great to have you with us, and please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for that lovely introduction, and thanks, Baktang, for the invitation to talk today. This is an important topic, and one that's seen a recent surge in interest from both the research and corporate spheres. I'm here today with Susan Kutz, really as a representative of the Kutz research group that she leads, and much of the work I'll be presenting today has been led by other graduate students and postdocs in that group and really represents a collective effort. We look forward to hearing your comments and questions at the end, and Susan will also be staying around to partake in that discussion. So I wanted to begin just by outlining what this talk is and what it is not. So as Nancy mentioned, I'm coming from a background in natural sciences, and my education has had little to no focus on Indigenous issues, and certainly not as they affect my research. But we're seeing an increasing push to take action towards reconciliation within the science community. And as an example, here's a quote from a recent paper that reconciliation requires a new way of conducting natural science, one that includes and respects Indigenous communities' rights and knowledge, leading to better scientific and community outcomes. This push towards more ethical research practices is different from the legal obligations of businesses and developers who are required to consult Indigenous peoples on issues affecting their land and rights. And this duty to consult and accommodate is not my area of expertise, but it's also seen an increasing profile, particularly with Canada's adoption of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which happened in 2010, and more recently in 2019 when BC was the first province to sign UNDRIP into legislation. But despite the differences between these sectors, I think both can benefit by asking what are the potential practical benefits of engaging with Indigenous peoples. And today I want to provide some examples of the benefits we've seen in our research in the Arctic. And I hope this might help reframe the duty to consult as a process with the potential to benefit all parties. Just a brief outline, I'm going to begin by defining Indigenous knowledge as I use it in this talk and introducing the concept of Edoaptamak, or two-eyed seeing. I'm then going to move on to some specific examples from our work in the Arctic co-monitoring wildlife health, and then end with some reflections on two-eyed seeing in research and when knowledge types seem to disagree. So what is Indigenous knowledge? I've heard that defining Indigenous knowledge is an inherently colonial exercise, but I'd like to define these terms how I use them, and I want to be clear that this is not necessarily how all Indigenous people would describe their own way of knowing. So Indigenous knowledge, you may have also come across the terms traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, and I'll use these terms as synonymous in this talk, although I do tend to avoid the term traditional ecological knowledge because I think it's a bit too narrow, perhaps, of a focus. A lot of research or a lot of knowledge that relates to activities such as crafting or cooking may actually be useful when thinking about ecological processes. As an example of that, the Inuit construct their drums using the lower abdominal skin from caribou, and they don't use the back skin, and the reason is that the back skin is covered in holes from the warble fly larvae, these parasitic larvae that embed in the skin of the backs of the caribou. And so the knowledge about this crafting and the ceremonial drum actually reflects some interesting parasite knowledge. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't want to narrow our scope to things that we assume are going to be ecological and excluding other types of information. We often think about Western science and Indigenous knowledge as a dichotomy, and there are important differences between them. Notably, Indigenous knowledge is a participatory knowledge system. It tends to be relational. Things are understood not as isolated entities, but in their relationships and by their influence on other phenomena. It's also intergenerational, so the knowledge is passed down through oral stories through generations. It's a holistic knowledge system, a weaving of relationships, and that's why I have this picture of weaving here. But this is starting to sound a lot like complex ecological systems, I think. Science, on the other hand, takes a reductionist approach, aiming to describe causal mechanisms between different pieces of ecosystems in order to understand the whole. So although there's this dichotomy, I think there is a common goal to understand the world around us. And these ways of knowing are also not mutually exclusive. In particular, Indigenous knowledge is often rational, comparative, and it's based on the repeated empirical observations of Indigenous peoples, and sometimes even through natural experiments. And finally, I think the differences between these knowledge types make them complementary, and I think there's a real power in using both knowledge types to understand ecological systems. And this complementarity was recognized by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, who coined the term Eduuptmak, or two-eyed seeing, and which he defined as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges, and learning to use both of these eyes together for the benefit of all. And this concept of two-eyed seeing is the approach that we strive for in our research, where we place equal weight on both ways of knowing, and I'm going to refer to this term throughout the talk today. So I kind of started out touching on some of the ethical benefits of two-eyed seeing or incorporating Indigenous knowledge, but I want to really dive into some of the potential practical benefits. And it's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples have a very close connection to the land, particularly in the Arctic. And so there's the opportunity for continuous observation of things that are happening on the land. And this is a particular benefit in the Arctic, where it's very expensive and logistically challenging to do scientific studies. And so scientific data are very limited to a few points in time. As an example of that, I have a figure here showing the number of muskox acute mortalities observed over a 5-6 year period. And this is from work of Matilda Tomaselli, who was a PhD student in Susan's lab. And the number of known cases of acute mortalities from official reporting, we know of just 10 cases that happened in 2010. But Matilda went into the community of Cambridge Bay and conducted interviews with local people to understand their observations of muskox mortalities. And doing that, she revealed a much broader pattern of increasing mortalities on the landscape, which may point to changing health of these animals. And so I think this just highlights the limitations of scientific study in a lot of ways and the potential benefits of drawing on this larger body of knowledge. Because of the continuous observation, there's also the opportunity for immediate reporting of any changes in ecosystems. Local people can act as sentinels of change. And as an example, aerial surveys of wildlife to estimate abundance may only be undertaken every 5 or every 10 years. And if there's rapid declines in populations, at this point, the point at which we observe those declines, it might be too late to turn them around. Whereas if we have continuous observations from local people about the animals that they're seeing and the abundance of animals, there's the opportunity to intervene before it's too late. And this can act as sort of an early warning system. I have a picture here of the DEW line, the distant early warning line system that was in place in the Arctic a number of years ago. Indigenous knowledge can also help identify historical baselines. So there's this concept of shifting baselines, a term that was coined by Daniel Pauly, a fisheries scientist at UBC. And this points to the fact that there may be a bias in our perception of what is healthy or normal due to persistent directional change, for example, decreasing abundance of fish or decreasing size of fish, and often a relatively short scientific record to look at baselines. And so we don't know what things were like 100 or sometimes even 10 years ago based on the scientific record. And this can result in mischaracterizing what a healthy natural ecosystem would look like. In particular, because a lot of data is collected through commercial fisheries or commercial harvests, and so there is no information on what a system was like prior to exploitation. And establishing baselines is important in order to know the magnitude of change over time. So an example of a study that drew on Indigenous knowledge to establish baselines is one by Lauren Eckert at the University of Victoria. And she looked at the size of yellow eye rockfish on the central coast of BC. And she examined scientific databases from both Fisheries and Oceans Canada and a local Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance database, and so found that in modern times, so sort of 2010 to 2015, the rockfish were about 50 centimeters in length. And then she went into communities and did interviews with local people, which corroborated the modern findings for rockfish size. So they confirmed that this was the size of fish that they're seeing in modern times. But she was also able to probe into what their historical observations of rockfish lengths were. And because of the much longer time frame of Indigenous knowledge here, she was able to establish a baseline from the 1950s to 1980s of what rockfish lengths were prior to exploitation. And so this study illustrated a repeatable method for using traditional and local knowledge to extend baselines, particularly for data-poor species, and highlighted the value of integrating Indigenous knowledge into fisheries research and management, or management more broadly. Another practical benefit is the opportunity for community buy-in to research results. If Indigenous people are engaged in the research, they're much more likely to accept the findings. And I'm going to introduce an example that I'll revisit throughout the talk of the dolphin and union caribou. This is a caribou herd that migrates across the sea ice seasonally to spend their summers on Victoria Island. And then in the fall, they wait for the ice to form, and they cross back over the strait to overwinter on the mainland. Aerial surveys from 2018 suggested that there'd been a dramatic decline in this herd. And so recently, the government of Nunavut enacted emergency management measures to restrict the harvest of dolphin and union caribou to just 42 animals. The local communities, however, were skeptical of these aerial surveys and the numbers, and they pushed back against these harvest restrictions because they weren't involved in the design or execution of these surveys. So this is an example where perhaps they didn't engage with communities in these surveys, and as a result, the communities were not necessarily agreeing with the outcome of that work. So the government has recognized this error and has vowed to engage local knowledge experts in future surveys to identify additional areas that should be surveyed, and also involve local communities in the survey work once it begins. And I'm going to revisit this story later in the talk. A last benefit of TwoEyed Seeing that I want to touch on is the co-interpretation of results with Indigenous people. So a key aspect of TwoEyed Seeing is that there's engagement with Indigenous people at all steps of the research. And this includes taking scientific results back to the community and asking, is this consistent with your understanding, and what does this mean to you? And as an example, a PhD student in the Kutz lab, Juliette DeFrancesco, who will be defending in just a few weeks now, she studied the cortisol, the stress hormone, in the hair of muskoxen around Kugluktuk. And she found interannual differences in cortisol of muskoxen, shown here, from 2013 to 2016. And she took these results back to the community and asked, are these consistent with your understanding? Do you think that muskoxen are increasingly more stressed? And why do you think that we're seeing these differences among years? And the insight she gained from talking to people about potential mechanisms has fueled further study of the system. And so there's this positive feedback between the Indigenous knowledge and their insights and the scientific studies. So despite these benefits, there's also some challenges. And I think, first of all, effective TwoEyed Seeing relies on building meaningful relationships and trust so that people are willing to talk to you and you understand their perspective. Indigenous cultures are also not always right down to business, and so this can take perhaps more time than you think, because they need to know you as a person before they're willing to interact with you professionally. And part of that building a relationship is understanding cultural values and adapting your studies accordingly. And Nancy alluded to this with her introduction and work ATCO has done with transmission lines. And we've also done this in our research. As example, the We do hunter-based sampling, where hunters collect biological samples that we bring back to the University of Calgary for analysis. And part of these sampling kits include the jaw of muskoxen or of caribou, so that we can see the health of the teeth. But it's come to light that the jaw can be a very culturally valuable piece of the animal, and so we've had to adapt our sampling kits so that individuals can submit the incisors only if they want to keep the whole jaw, and we're fine with that. There's also real and perceived biases about Indigenous knowledge. In particular, I've seen again and again this desire for scientific credibility, or a desire to validate Indigenous knowledge against scientific knowledge. And I think it's important to recognize that no one way of knowing has a monopoly on the truth, and we have to recognize the legitimacy of multiple ways of knowing. And I can tell you firsthand that this is hard for scientists. But I think a good start is to more critically examine the gaps and biases in scientific knowledge. And I already mentioned the idea of aerial surveys for wildlife abundance. Is a survey that happens once every 10 years really a more legitimate form of knowledge than continuous local observation of people who are always out on the land? I think this is up for debate, and it's likely that each of these approaches has their benefits and drawbacks. Knowledge of the methods for documenting Indigenous knowledge can be a barrier to people who are trained in scientific methods. So there's special skills involved in conducting interviews as well as obtaining consent. And it's important to understand the methods and or work with people who are familiar with them. Finally, I think one of the challenges to mobilizing Indigenous knowledge in research and decision making is that the frameworks we have in place today often rely on quantifiable metrics because they're based in Western science. And in the long term, I think we need to rethink our models. If we want to truly give Indigenous peoples a seat at the management tables, we need to rethink these models to better incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing. But this is going to take a long time. And in the short term, perhaps there's a need for translators or frameworks that can incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the existing environmental governance models. And I'm going to touch on that later in the talk today. So I want to move on now to some specific examples from our Arctic research. And I want to start by motivating the need for monitoring in the Arctic. So we've heard about the extreme climate change that is being seen in the Arctic, and business as usual climate scenarios project that Arctic temperatures may increase in the range of 8 to 12 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. In addition, Arctic ecosystems are particularly sensitive to warming because often a transition of just 2 degrees crosses that boundary from freezing to warming. This is one of the reasons. There's many reasons why Arctic ecosystems are sensitive. And the polar bear is sort of the poster child for the effects of climate change in the Arctic. But the impacts are much more widespread and often less obvious. For example, research in Susan's group by Pratap Kafel, who was a former PhD student, looked at the expansion of muskox lungworms northward as the climate is shifting. And these lungworms, they have an intermediate snail host, and so their life cycle, their survival is highly dependent on temperature because of that intermediate host. And what Pratap found is if he looked at the ability of this parasite to transmit as a function of temperature, he could map out where the parasite was able to persist. And if he looked at its range in the 1980s when temperatures were lower, he found that there wasn't really much chance for transmission in the Arctic archipelago, these islands up here. And surveys of muskoxen found no instances of these lungworms in muskoxen in the area. But fast forwarding to recent decade, there's a higher theoretical potential for transmission because of temperature increases. And indeed, surveys of animals in the Arctic has found sort of this northward moving wave of positive cases of parasites and many positive cases on the island. And so this is one example of an impact of climate change that is maybe not at the forefront of the public's mind, but these are the kind of things that we're seeing happen in the Arctic with climate change. And I think they emphasize the need for monitoring wildlife health. In addition to the changes to ecosystems, there's a strong reliance of Inuit on country foods. And so these changes to wildlife have very real implications for the human population in the north. This is a picture of two Inuit women eating bowhead whale blubber, which is a very common sight in the north. And on the right here is a picture of processed food from the south, Cheese Whiz, and you can see the price tag here is $30 for a bottle of Cheese Whiz. But it's not even entirely about the cost, although that's a factor. Sometimes food just isn't available. So if the weather's bad and the resupply plane can't land, it doesn't matter how much money you have, there's not any food in the grocery store, and there's only one grocery store in town. So having access to country foods is essential for food security in the Arctic as well. And climate change impacts on wildlife have real repercussions for the health of people in the north. And so I think these points all emphasize the need for monitoring in the Arctic as we see climate change happening. So the community-based wildlife health monitoring programs that Susan and her group have started are mainly based in 3 communities in the Arctic: Kugluktuk, Uluuktuk on Victoria Island, and Ecological or Cambridge Bay. And I want to make note of all the people who are working in these communities, because as I mentioned before, the work I'm presenting today is largely a group effort. And so these are the folks who are working regularly in those communities to support this monitoring. And as proof that they do go out in the field, when I first looked for mugshots, these are the ones I found of people bundled up and unrecognizable in their fur and down coats. So there's a huge participation from the lab, spending lots of time in these communities to make these programs happen. But of course, there's also people in communities who are supporting this work and making it happen. And you realize the value of these community relationships, especially in a global pandemic, when suddenly we're not allowed to go up into the communities anymore. And so it's been increasingly important to have these strong relationships so that we can do things like virtual meetings with people. The community-based programs take advantage of several different approaches to data collection and documenting knowledge. And these approaches kind of all fall in the intersection of Indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge, and also local knowledge. I didn't introduce this before, but I included local knowledge here because the reality in the Arctic is that anything that might be considered local knowledge in other studies is hard to separate from Indigenous knowledge, because 95% of the communities or more are Indigenous. And so local knowledge, is going to be affected by the cultural values of Indigenous people. And so I tend to use the term Indigenous knowledge. But it also includes more contemporary local knowledge as well. So the approaches that are used is harvest-based sampling, where hunters will go and collect biological samples from the harvested animals and keep these in standardized sample kits. And then they're sent to the University of Calgary for analysis for things like stress hormones that I mentioned already, tooth health, as well as parasite abundance. So all those health metrics can be analyzed here in the South. Importantly, these hunter survey kits also include forms for hunter observations when they're out at the land. So it's not just about the biological samples and the scientific data that come from the kits. It's also about documenting their observations. The second approach is interviews, and there are annual interviews conducted with hunters to understand their contemporary observations, but also interviews with elders and hunters to document baseline information. Targeted sampling that can happen, for example, when there's acute mortalities, scientific studies that are aimed to address certain hypotheses, and then we also work with government and help contribute to their monitoring of both health and population abundance. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the interview methods, because I think that's an approach that maybe is less well known to the scientific community and in decision one of the approaches that has been very successful in these programs in generating semi-quantitative information is proportional piling. And the idea with proportional piling is to have a fixed volume of some counter, so we use beans, as a unit of measure. And these beans are given to a group, and this group works together to separate counters proportionally into different categories. And then once they've come to a consensus, we can measure the counters by weight or by volume to determine the precise proportions in each category. And so this is a group activity, and it's consensus-based. And this means that it tends to be much more accurate than individual perceptions because you're relying on what's known as the wisdom of the crowd. And it can be used to document different types of information. So for example, demographic information, the number of individuals, male, female, calves or yearlings. Information on body condition among different categories. So this is showing excellent, good, fairly good, or poor body condition. It can also be used to look at the spatial distribution of animals at different periods in time. So participants can be asked to pile the beans where they mostly see animals or where they think animals are. And it's important to interpret these in the context of where hunters are moving or where they have insights for. As an example of the output from these types of exercises, here's a figure showing the relative abundance of dolphin and union caribou over time. And each one of these points is the consensus-based estimate from a group. And this trend line here is a fit through all the different groups, all the estimates from all the different groups. So here it's the relative abundance. And so groups will be asked, here's all of these beans is the most caribou you've ever seen. When would this be? And then you try and probe out different points in time. So, okay, relative to that, in your most recent hunting trip, what proportion of this would you say was out there? And the points here are based on group interviews with hunters and elders in Cambridge Bay, Ecological. And this work was done by Matilda Tomaselli. She was one of the first to use these approaches. And based on this trend line of relative abundance, she divided the time into a pre-decline period and a decline period. And then based on those two periods, she probed a bit deeper into what the population structure and health was in these two different periods. And as an example of the output, this inset figure here shows the proportion of animals in different body condition categories. And again, this information was gleaned using these proportional piling exercises. So here we can see that in the pre-decline period, there was a relatively high proportion of animals that were in excellent or good condition. Whereas during the decline period, there were more animals in fairly good or poor condition. And this suggests that with the decline in abundance, there was also a decline in body condition of the animals. Now, I mentioned that these interviews were done in Cambridge Bay or Ecological. More recently, the same process has been used to document knowledge from people in Kutz, a nearby community. And using the same approaches, we can look at the trend line from that community, and they both show declines in recent years. But if we look at the peak abundance in Kutz occurred about 10 years previous. And this suggests that perhaps the distribution of caribou is shifting as abundance changes, which is not surprising. Historically, we've seen that migration patterns of caribou can change as they become more or less abundant. But this suggests that there's possible shifts in distribution happening that may affect also the outcomes of these aerial surveys, which are designed in a standardized way to always capture abundance at the same location. And so I'm going to revisit that example of dolphin and union caribou, where remember the locals disputed the findings of these surveys. And it's possible that changes to migration and the distribution of animals are underlying the different observations of local people versus the standardized surveys. So these approaches that I've talked about are very effective at documenting knowledge. But the next step is trying to present this information in a way that it can be readily incorporated into co-management processes. And I mentioned before that environmental decision-making often relies on quantifiable metrics. And there's a short-term need for translators or frameworks that can help translate Indigenous knowledge into information that's more readily incorporated into management. And so I want to now just touch a little bit on a framework that we've developed to take information from our co-monitoring programs and move it into a format that can be incorporated in co-management. I do want to note there are disparate views on the use of Indigenous knowledge to inform decision making. And as an example, here's a quote from a recent paper from researchers at the University of Toronto, stating that seeking Indigenous knowledge to inform environmental decision making implies that Indigenous peoples are stakeholders, as opposed to self-determining nations with rights and responsibilities regarding their knowledge systems and lands. So this is just a cautionary note that there are differing views on incorporating Indigenous knowledge into management. And I think these more negative views perhaps stem from the historical misuse of Indigenous knowledge in decision making. And this is a nice figure that I think illustrates that from a recent paper by Andrea Reid, who's a Indigenous fisheries scientist at UBC. And she illustrated 3 different ways in which Indigenous knowledge can be used in decision making. The status quo, or I like to think of it as the historical way, I like to think we're moving past this, but decisions were largely made based on Western science and Western science alone. And then with increasing recognition of the value of Indigenous knowledge, we moved to a space where Indigenous knowledge was perhaps being incorporated, but mostly being assimilated into Western scientific processes for decision making, and not truly being recognized as its own legitimate way of knowing. And more recently, I think we're moving into a paradigm of knowledge coexistence, or this two-eyed seeing approach, where we really recognize the individual, the unique nature of Indigenous knowledge, and that it's an equally legitimate form of knowing. And here's a quote from a recent paper that Susan and Matilda co-authored. Combining Indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge will help achieve better informed and more timely and effective decision making on wildlife health and conservation. And I'd like to think that we're moving towards this framework. So as an example of how we can do that, I'd like to introduce this framework that we recently published in Arctic Science, which takes the information from these co-monitoring projects and incorporates it into indicators and benchmarks to arrive at sort of a traffic light approach to wildlife status, which can then be used in management. And this framework was inspired by the Canada's policy for the conservation of wild salmon and their framework for assessing biological status. And this relies on having multiple indicators of status, and under each indicator, specific quantifiable metrics. So as an example, one of the indicators used for salmon is abundance. And then a specific quantifiable metric under that would be the number of spawners that they count in the streams in their most recent generation. For each of these metrics, it's not enough just to measure it. We need to know what that value means. What is it relative to historical or healthy populations? And so here we need to define benchmarks on that metric that will allow us to delineate different status zones. And this framework relies on a traffic light approach where there's a lower benchmark that delineates a red and amber status zone, where a red status zone indicates there's a high risk of extirpation for that population. This is bad. And then there's an upper benchmark that delineates amber and green status, where green indicates healthy and resilient populations. So this is the framework that we use, but we adapted it so that these different metrics can be informed by different knowledge types. And ideally, each indicator has a metric that's informed by Indigenous knowledge and at least one that's informed by Western science in order to leverage that complementarity of the two different knowledge types. So one example of an indicator is body condition of musk oxen. And I want to move through some data and how we'd actually implement this framework as an example. So under the indicator body condition, a metric that we can record is the back fat thickness of harvested animals. And in our hunter sampling kits that we give out, hunters are given a little paper ruler in order to measure back fat thickness. And this figure here shows observations of back fat over a 4-year period from 2016 to 2019, collected by hunters in Uluwaktuk. And small dots are one observation, and the larger dots indicate multiple observations, up to 400. The line here is just a trend line through those points. And so this is a metric, and it's interesting to look at. You have the seasonal variability, but what does it mean? Is it good or is it bad? How is the population doing? And in order to answer that question, we need to think about benchmarks on this metric. We can derive benchmarks from the data themselves. So we can look at quantiles of the historical data, and that's what these lines show. So here, I've just taken the quantiles of these historical data. So the 75th would be this upper benchmark, and the 50th is the lower benchmark. And I've calculated these by season because there are these seasonal differences that we have to take into account. And according to these benchmarks, the population is sort of in an amber status right now. But this is looking at the baselines just over this 4-year period. And I mentioned before this idea of shifting baselines. Ideally, we have a much longer record that we can draw on when trying to establish what is healthy and what is not. So one way to do this is to look at the interviews, the information that's coming out of interviews with elders. And this is a quote from one of Matilda's studies from Cambridge Bay, where she said, "It was common to hunt muskoxen and caribou with 5 to 8 centimeters of back fat during the pre-decline period, and the population's doing well. Whereas at the time of the interview, you would be very lucky to get an animal with 3 centimeters of back fat, but usually they have 1 centimeter or nothing." And so this information is drawing on a much longer time frame of observation over that hunter's lifespan. And we can look at that here as another form of benchmark. So this shows those benchmarks of 1 centimeter or 5 centimeters as a lower and upper. And in this case, it agrees with our current data, and the population would be classified as amber under both sets of benchmarks. But this might not always be the case, especially if you have shifting baselines. So I think if it's possible to dive a bit deeper into the historical baselines using with interviews, then that can be a really valuable tool. So this is just one metric that I've gone through. I'm not going to go through any others, but we do in our paper go through another metric under body condition, which is the relative condition from those proportional piling exercises. And then a challenge at the end is to integrate these different metrics in order to understand overall status. And I'm not going to go through this today, but I think this step, it's very important to consult and co-interpret these different metrics with communities, try and understand why there's disagreements when there are. So a question that comes up after seeing this framework is, which indicators and metrics are most relevant to population viability? And this might be a question that you want to answer before you even start collecting the data. But in this case, the research is ongoing. And this is a question that we're just striving to answer now by relating these different health indicators to the population trends derived from both Indigenous knowledge and aerial scientific surveys. And so I wanted to touch a little bit towards the end of the talk here on different approaches for modeling and understanding Indigenous knowledge in research. There's increasing interest in including Indigenous knowledge in modeling, but as with decision making, I think we have to be very careful in these approaches that we're not assimilating Indigenous knowledge into Western science approaches. One modeling approach that can accommodate qualitative information and ensure that Indigenous knowledge isn't swamped by data is Bayesian approaches. And I was warned not to get too technical in this talk, but just as a broad overview, the idea in a Bayesian analysis is that you have some prior information on the parameters or the model that you're interested in, and then you have some data as well. And the outcome from your analysis, or the best guess at what's happening in the system, is based on both that prior information and the data in hand. And it's possible in this framework to incorporate Indigenous knowledge as prior information. In fact, it's very well suited to that. And prior information is often, expert knowledge is used there, but Indigenous knowledge is well suited to that. And as an example of this happening, there's a student, Rowena Greiba at UBC, who's using this approach to understand ring seal habitat use in Alaska. And so she has data from callers, and this figure just shows the caller track of a ring seal in Alaska. But she's also going into communities and interviewing elders to ask them what what they know about habitat use and incorporating that as prior information in her models. So you'll have to stay tuned for her work because I don't think she's published any of that yet, but it's a very interesting area of study. Another approach that's being used is Bayesian Beliefnets. This is an example of a conceptual belief net from a recent paper looking at ecosystem health in the Slave River Delta. And it's a bit overwhelming, but if we zoom in on just one part of this, which looks at fish health index, we can see that the authors have incorporated both Indigenous knowledge and scientific data to understand fish health. So in particular, they had Indigenous knowledge nodes including fish usage. So this is asking people how has the number of fish you caught changed over time. And then scientific indicators include things like concentrations of mercury in fish, so much more measurable, quantifiable metrics. And so both Indigenous knowledge and scientific data can be used to calculate the conditional probabilities between these different nodes, and then the parameterized model can be used to examine the sensitivity of the system or ecosystem health to changes in these different indicators and try and understand which are the most important. One interesting thing about the study is that out of the 7 pairs of comparable indicators that they used in the Bayesian belief net, traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge directly contradicted each other only once in the whole study. And this brings me to the last point I wanted to touch on, which is when knowledge types seem to disagree. I think, although this might seem like a bit of a conundrum, it's really an opportunity for new insights into ecological processes. It's an opportunity to examine why the knowledge types might disagree, which can lead to new insights, but also improve dialogue among partners and the co-generation of solutions. It highlights the need for continued data collection and discussion, and points to the gaps and biases in both knowledge types. And I think it's important to not assume that the scientific knowledge is right, and we need to examine the biases in the Indigenous knowledge, because it can, the more I learn about this, the more I question the bias in our Western scientific knowledge as well. So you really have to examine the biases in both knowledge types to try and understand why there's a difference. And I just wanted to return as a last point to this example of the dolphin and Union caribou and the surveys. So you'll remember the government of Nunavut has done these aerial surveys and found that there's very few caribou, but the local people have had some skepticism over those results, saying that we see caribou, they're just in different places. And if we look at how the scientific surveys are done, these caribou, as I mentioned, they migrate over the sea ice, and so they tend to aggregate on the southern shore of Victoria Island before crossing over. And that's when the aerial surveys are done, targeting this very small area. So it's entirely possible that they're missing caribou that might be in different places or might have changed their behavior. And so this is a limitation of the standardized scientific method that I think we really need to look hard at when we're interpreting the results of these surveys. And so I just wanted to note that this year, just recently last month, they redid the survey over an expanded area, including areas around communities that the local people said they've seen caribou. And so these surveys were just completed in October, and it has yet to be seen whether they reveal higher caribou numbers than the initial scientific surveys or not. But you can stay tuned for that result. So in conclusion, just a few parting remarks. Indigenous knowledge, I think it's important to recognize that it's not data. It's inseparable from the knowledge holders and from the place. And there's a need to engage with Indigenous knowledge holders throughout the research process, from forming the questions to presenting the results and co-interpreting the outcomes. But inclusion of Indigenous knowledge can add information like data does, leading to more defensible research outcomes, and more defensible both ethically and practically, particularly in regions like the Arctic where scientific data are limited. And engaging with Indigenous knowledge can be daunting for non-Indigenous people and for scientists not trained in these methods, like myself. But I think the bottom line is to remember that it's not about the knowledge, it's about the people. And if you can remember that, then your research or your assessments are likely to proceed in an ethical way and lead to more robust outcomes. So I want to thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, and Susan's also here to ask questions. And so thank you very much.
Vaktang, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. As we're going to dive into our Q&A session, a reminder to use the question icon to ask questions. It is a moderated format, so once the questions are published by myself and my co-moderators, you can see them and upvote it if you like. I would do my best to select a broad range of questions if we cannot get through all of them today. We have about 34 minutes left for questions. So I will just start addressing the first question, maybe first to Dr. Peacock first and Dr. Kutz afterwards. Have there been positive occurrence outcomes noted during interviews, or most of the information provided indicating mostly negative impacts on wildlife numbers and conditions? So please, Dr. Peacock.
I was going to pass this one to Susan. I think she might have a better historical insight into observations over time.
Sure. Actually, I think one of your slides really presented that well, and the one on body condition. And you can see in that slide, I don't know if you can go to it, Steph, but within that slide, you actually see that the animals are improved, not that one, the from the data sheets, the one near the end. But through that, so these were data, yeah, there we go. So these are real data generated on muskoxen at Ulahukto, and what you see over multiple time periods here is that in fact the muskoxen are getting into better condition. We're seeing them in better body condition over time. So, and we also have somewhat encouraging information coming out of more recent years for the dolphin and Union caribou herd, where people are saying, you know, they're in good condition this year. There's more calves out there. So yes, we get negative things. There's fewer animals. They're in poor condition. We see diseases, but the longer we do this, we're now starting to see these trends. We're able to track things over time and determine if there's a change. So yes, there are some positive things. And I guess on that, I'd also say that we do look at this very much as a potential proactive indicator of what's going on. So as Stephanie had said, population surveys, unless a population is crashing, they're typically only done every 5-10 years if we're lucky. But these type of indicators like body condition, number of calves out there, number of animals, are things that we can use in between these survey years to say, well, what's happening with this herd? Does it look like it's getting better or worse? If it's getting worse, let's get out there with the airplanes and count animals and look at management actions.
Thank you. Next, we're coming to two most popular questions so far. The first one is from George Constantinescu. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. Is there any specific element that you consider to be key to a successful engagement with Indigenous knowledge? Something that allowed you to achieve the level of trust essential for close collaboration? And I will probably address it to Dr. Kutz first.
Yeah, I mean, the single word is trust, right? It's about honoring the relationship. It's about trust and integrity and time. And usually, you know, historically in academia, none of the grants allowed you that time. It didn't allow you to travel to go back. But it's about spending that time with people, honoring them as people, you know, as friends, as colleagues, and spending the time. The other thing, which I think is relevant with our research, is what we do, people really care about. So wildlife are just integral to people's culture, to their livelihoods, to their food safety and security. And so it's always something that is of common interest. So that's definitely, you know, having that point, having that, I don't want to say hook, but having that topic that we're, you know, both parties are really interested in and passionate about. That wasn't one word.
Thank you. Dr. Peacock, do you have anything to add to this?
That
The slight technical difficulties, I guess.
question.
I think. So maybe we can go to the following question, which is also very popular. During the pandemic, what methods are working the best for interacting with the communities where your research is conducted? I think let's address that to Dr. Peacock first.
Stage of needing to go validate new and it's a challenge, but I think having those relationships with the community so that you can work solutions, you know, having contacts in the community so that you can potentially have them facilitate virtual meetings is really valuable. Susan, do you have something to add there?
Sure, I think you hit on the main things there, but I just want to give you a quick example of one of the challenges we've had. So we've got good relationships with the communities we're working closely with, and we have, in many of the communities, the granting that we've got has paid for people to be the local assistants, and so their job is becoming greater because now they're the facilitator between us remotely. But one of our challenges up there is internet. So another postdoc of mine is trying to arrange feedback sessions with people who were interviewed to confirm that how we interpreted the interviews was correct. But there is no common location that these sessions can be held because of poor internet. And so we are literally renting a hotel room so that interviews can happen in the hotel room where there is good internet to make this happen. But yeah, the pandemic has kind of blown everything up on us, and it's made us really think about how to do things. There's some good things. It's leading to increased capacity building from the perspective of communities in the North and people learning more computer skills so that they can interact remotely with us. And it's making us think a little bit more on our feet, for sure.
Thank you. So next question was from Greg Bereza. I hope I pronounced it right. Several years ago, I was in Alberta Environment. I was involved in the effort to combine TEK and Western science into the State of Aquatic Ecosystem Report in the Mackenzie River Basin. At that time, we were using the 1991 Northern River Basin Study as an important baseline and enhancing that with more recent input from Indigenous communities. Just wondering if there's been a more recent comprehensive study to update the baseline of the North River Basin Study. And I guess let's address it to probably Dr. Kutz, maybe.
I think we should address that one to Dr. Peacock.
Oh, Dr. Peacock? All right, so sure.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular report, but I know there have been a number of studies. I mentioned one on the Slave River Delta and also several river systems up north that may be related to this. So I'd have to look into that. I don't know off the top of my head, but certainly there's been a surge in research incorporating Indigenous perspectives, and I would be surprised if this hasn't moved forward in that direction.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Reed Merrill. Dr. Peacock, thank you for this excellent presentation. through your work, you have seen any, have you seen any examples of Indigenous knowledge being used in Indigenous consultation process or resource development projects?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I thought we might get some like this because this is an obvious area of research or area of interest for this audience. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's not really my area of expertise, and I don't have anything that comes to mind right now. But maybe Susan, do you have any ideas?
Yeah.
There certainly are examples.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe not so much as part of the consultation or resource development, but certainly in conservation, the last example that Stephanie showed with the population survey on the caribou and how that is directly using Indigenous knowledge to revamp that population survey. So it's being incorporated in there. But I can't say really with some of these others. I mean, there's certainly, and maybe this is a little bit of the point, is that there's lots of consultation, there are lots of meetings, and the question is, how do you actually mobilize the knowledge that's coming out of there in a way that it can be used in development projects, in consultations, in development plans. And I suppose the other piece of that is also when we're looking at some of the resource development and subsequent monitoring and environmental impact assessments, we generally base those on our scientific knowledge. And I think that the model that Stephanie's developed and presented here really says, you know, what are the Indigenous measures of ecosystem health, the Indigenous measures of potential impact? What should we be looking at and measuring? It's not just about the metrics that we use as scientists. It is about that broader understanding of the land.
Vak, can I just interject? It's Nancy here. I think it's a really good question, and I think it just highlights the importance of this speaker series, actually, in that this understanding, or a better understanding of the science that is going into conservation in the Arctic, and particularly for our company as we are in the subarctic and the Arctic, and as we see development continuing to increase. Whilst it wasn't intentional in terms of our consultation, we did learn a lot about the migratory path of the caribou, and as a result actually changed the way the development was engineered and constructed. And so I think the intersection, you know, one of your early or one of my earlier comments was the intersection of Indigenous peoples, wildlife, and human interaction, and how we, a Western world interaction, I should say. I think it's just going to become, for me, it's very promising and optimistic that we can find these ways to have much better conversations built on trust and real relationships that are developed, and actually listen to each other in terms of what's important to each other. And the whole construct of mutual benefits is so important if we want to develop in a sustainable and practical way. So I just think this is very encouraging, and I'm so happy to see, you know, on that line that I was talking about, we didn't have one intervention, not one obstruction on that line, because of the over 3,000 meetings that occurred, and actually listening and changing the project to accommodate the Indigenous knowledge about the caribou's migration. So I think it's really encouraging. Can I just ask also questions now that I put my mic
Absolutely.
back on? How do you accommodate the concept of evolution and natural management of populations, and the data, the science that you're putting into this, and the Indigenous knowledge? So, you know, not that I have any any real understanding of evolution. But it does appear that there are certain points in time, if a population rises too high, then there are certain occurrences of adaptation or a culling of the not so healthy part of the herd in order to accommodate what Mother Earth will be able to feed those animals or those herds. So how do you accommodate the concept of evolution with all of the conservation data and information you're gathering?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Nancy. And I think one specific example of that is with caribou populations.
Yeah.
There's knowledge of these long-term cycles, natural cycles in caribou populations on the scale of 70 or 80 years. So we see these fluctuations. And I think, understanding where we are in that cycle is perhaps easier with the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, because like I mentioned, our scientific understanding might be very limited to the last 20, maybe 60 years if we're lucky. And so we're not even capturing a full cycle of that natural population fluctuation. And so really we have no way to understand whether this decline that we're seeing, is it normal? Is it part of the normal population dynamics? Or is it something that's perhaps exacerbated by anthropogenic effects that we need to be concerned about? And I think by drawing on Indigenous knowledge, we can start to understand better where we sit in a longer historical context. So I think that's exactly why there's real value to digging deeper into this. Susan, do you have anything to add?
I think you hit it right on the head there. I think the caribou, barren ground caribou, and these massive population fluctuations over time is such a good example of where Indigenous, that's just part of the Indigenous knowledge. Anyone you talk to will talk about caribou being there and then caribou going away for a long time and in their grandma's time or in their youth or whatever. So that's there. That understanding is definitely there. And then Nancy, you mentioned the part about when populations get high and what are the animals being culled, and that is something also that comes out very regularly in discussing with elders. It's those weak ones will be taken away. The wolves will keep the caribou healthy. So I think that even though you may not call it evolution and adaptation, that is in a way a fundamental concept in the thinking of the Indigenous history and the traditional knowledge that's just been passed down. And yes, that these populations will change and adapt. I often reflect on that because people do talk about, the caribou have gone down, but they'll come back. The elders say they'll come back. And I suppose I wonder if we're at a point where there's so much change, climate change really being the big driver up there, that, will they come back? Will that natural resilience, and do they have the genetic capital to continue on? So I guess time will tell.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank you. Next question from Justin Young. Thanks for this presentation, very interesting. I'm wondering if there are future plans, or maybe this has already happened, to expand this research to Indigenous people in Arctic locations further afield. For example, Scandinavia or Siberia, to build an even broader ecological understanding of the Arctic. So maybe Stephanie?
I'll pass this one to Susan for her first try.
Is that like, can I make a phone call?
Yeah.
I think, I'd like to say people are doing, there are a lot of people out there in the Arctic doing really good work on Indigenous knowledge. And I would say in Scandinavia, it's happening very much with the Sami. And in Russia, maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent. But I can't really speak to that. Sorry, my Roomba started moving here, the hazards. So we do work, like the Circum-Arctic wildlife health community is pretty small, and we do work with colleagues around the Arctic on this. So some of the hunter-based sampling or the the less invasive methods for monitoring are being implemented in different degrees in some of these places. But I guess I just really want to acknowledge there is a lot of other work going on out there incorporating and bringing together different types of knowledge beyond what we're doing.
Thank you. So next question is from Hannah Brown. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this talk. It was fascinating and highly important. I would like to know how a scientist would play a role in assuring that Indigenous people are self-determining when conducting studies on their land. Susan?
Sure. I think that this is something that Canada has been very good at, and the Indigenous communities in the Canadian Arctic and Subarctic have been really good at within the research community. It is, you know, it's written in the land claims. It is just part of doing business in the North, and we're all growing and adapting and learning how to do this. But I think just there's some fundamental documents. There's the Inuit Tapiniriap Kanatami put out a document on doing research with Indigenous peoples, or with Inuit. And this, Canada is actually a leader, I think, in this area. I've gone to meetings where people are working in Africa and Southeast Asia and doing community-based work, but I think Canada, from the perspective of thinking about Indigenous rights, and with the, again, I speak mostly of the land claims agreements in the Arctic, so that's what I'm more familiar with, but a lot of this is written in there, and so I suppose it's, as scientists and as me as a principal investigator, it's on my back to make sure that my students are aware of that they're familiar with these, and we work within that context and try to facilitate it when we're there. And so it's an attitude shift, I guess. It's a way of working with people.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Hannah, that's a very important question, and thank you for bringing it up. I mean, I'm a 12th generation Canadian settler. I'm not Indigenous. And ideally, you'd have an Indigenous person here presenting this research. And an important part of the work that Susan and the group has done up north is helping to bring the research to the youth in the community through education programs and classroom presentations to sort of foster that interest and spark to encourage more Indigenous students to pursue careers in science and hopefully build that, I should say, not build the capacity, but mobilize the capacity of these people to do the research themselves. So it's, you know, right now we can engage Indigenous people in all parts of the research process and build, you know, in the longer term, work towards them conducting the research themselves. And the first step to that is through education and trying to remove some of the barriers that they experience.
Thank you. There's a couple more questions left, and we're approaching the end of our meeting in 10 minutes. So next question is from Justin Curtis. Excellent presentation, very informative, but what a suspenseful ending with the caribou population. Where can the final numbers be obtained once available? For once, I'm very curious to see if the herd has changed its migration pattern due to climate change or other factors. So, Stephanie, please resolve the suspense for us.
Yeah, so I can tell you that they've done the surveys, but there's a modeling analysis that has to be done in order to translate what they see into an overall population estimate, and they're in the process of doing that work right now. I think the timeline for results is over the next few weeks, but then those results will probably have to be written up into a technical report that will be made available through the government of Nunavut. I don't have a link on hand for where that will be published, but I'm sure if you keep checking back into the government of Nunavut page and monitor the news stories for CBC North or other northern news outlets, you'll be seeing it there. Susan, do you have anything else? No? Okay.
And I believe what is our final question, perhaps, unless we get more. Thank you so much from Sarah Hurtle. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you so much for the great talk. It was great to be able to tune in from Lethbridge. From a TK rather than a Western science perspective, what do you learn about parasitology from community partners? For example, do you use the proportional piling exercise to document prevalence intensity of parasites, perhaps during harvest? So maybe Stephanie first.
Sure, I'll just say a few words and then Susan might have more ideas on this. But I don't know if the piling exercise has been used for parasite abundance. Oh, Susan's nodding, so I'll let her add on that. But I will say that we do document observations that hunters have, for example, of like rough skin, which can indicate a parasite under the skin on their legs. And so we take these observations from hunters, which can shed light on parasite abundance. But Susan, do you have other things to add there?
Yeah, sure. This is dear. Parasites are dear to my heart, of course, because that's where I started in the Arctic. So yes, some of the work Matilda Tomaselli did, she actually asked specifically about different diseases. She did some proportional piling to identify which diseases were most common, but not as much. And if we do this, as we do this again, we're asking the questions a little bit differently to understand trends in the individual parasites. So, and from the perspective of diseases, one of the abnormalities people had reported was limping animals, which led to a further investigation to understand why that was. That ended up being brucellosis increasing in the animals. So yes, we can document it, and we can look at changes over time, and most of the work with the proportional piling, it's important to note that it's usually not absolute numbers. It's trends, it's proportional to the past, it's proportional to something else. So we have used it like that. And there's more I could say on that, but I'm wary of time. So.
Thank you very much. I believe this was our last question. So that will conclude our session. I would like to thank everybody who joined us, the speakers, Stephanie Peacock and Susan Kutz, for this wonderful presentation and for the work you're doing in this important subject. I would like to thank Nancy Southern for joining us and the team who has been working diligently behind the curtains with me, Nisha Mohan, Kurt Kutz, and my fellow co-moderators, Nicole Mind and Jay Massey, and Shane Moore. Thank you very much, and I will hope to see you in soon for our next lecture.
Thank you all very much. It was super interesting. Bye for now.
Thank you so much for the invitation. We really enjoyed it.
Bye, thank you.